All right, without further ado, Richard Carrier.
Operate MuggleTech. Okay. One of the advantages of speaking to a large audience of young atheists is that you have no end of tech geniuses to help you out if something goes wrong. But a special shout out to Daryl Ray, whose computer I'm relying on today. All right, I'm going to tell you about Bayes' theorem. What on earth is that? I had a gentleman came up to me a little earlier and said, you know, I looked that up on the web. And he said, are you sure? And I'll show you what scared him. This is Bayes' theorem. So you're probably going, what the fuck? By the end of this talk, 83.4% of you will understand what this means. Now, it can be written in other ways. There's shorter forms of it, and a variety of different ways you can write it, but those all just conceal the fact that it's really this. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Now, why talk about Bayes' theorem? Now, I use it as the logic of explanation. There's a lot of different ways that you can use Bayes' theorem because it's kind of a universal theorem for any kind of analysis of probabilities. But I use it in this particular way, and so the rest of my talk is going to be about this particular kind of application of Bayes' theorem. And I'll be using it to model how we determine the most likely explanation of a body of evidence. So which means the most likely cause of that evidence. And for us, you know, we talk about, is it God, is it aliens, is it psychic powers, or is it just normal shit? And the way Bayes' theorem works is once you decide on what the undisputed facts are, the facts everybody can agree on, you can then determine what caused those facts. And that's the particular advantage of Bayes. Now, if you want to learn more about Bayes, because I can't really give you a complete survey of it here, I have a useful page, richardcarrier.info/bayescalculator.html, that will tell you more cool stuff. And I have someone who's designing an app for me. It'll go up there. It'll have all kinds of different kinds of calculators where you can just plug in numbers and it'll do the math for you. Okay, so where does this thing come from, Bayes' theorem? It's actually quite old. It was originally formulated by Thomas Bayes in the middle of the 18th century, but he didn't formalize it in the modern notation and modern concepts that we have now. The formal proof of it and the formalization that we are familiar with now came from the greatest mathematician of the 19th century, Pierre-Simon Laplace, and then you might know him as one of the famous atheists who replied to Napoleon, how come there's no God in your equations? And he says, I have no use for that hypothesis. And then in the 20th century, one of the most important contributors to the development of Bayes' theorem is E.T. Jaynes, because he showed how all scientific methods could really be reduced to it in one way or another. So it's been around for quite a long time, 300 years almost. So what is it? It's a description of valid inductive reasoning. It's a formally valid deductive argument, with just three premises. So if the premises can't be denied, then the conclusion can't be denied either. It's a logically necessary conclusion, given those premises. And its conclusion is the probability that a claim is true, and all its premises are statements of probability. So why the big-ass equation? The reason is that all empirical inductive reasoning is probabilistic. There's always some chance of being wrong, and those chances vary. And since probability is by definition mathematical, I mean, some things are more probable than others, some things are less probable than others, it follows that the logic of correct reasoning has to be mathematical. It's the only way you can model how this kind of reasoning works. And when you work it out, you do the math, you figure out what the correct model is, Bayes' theorem is what you get. Now, this part of it here is a bold statement. There are mathematicians who will argue with me on this, philosophers who will argue with me on this, but I'm going to prove it in a book coming soon, which I'll talk about in a moment. And this is my bold statement here, is that Bayes' theorem is the mathematical model for all correct reasoning about empirical claims. Every time you reason correctly, you are following Bayes' theorem, even if you don't know it. And if you aren't following it, you aren't reasoning correctly. And understanding Bayes' theorem is therefore the key to understanding correct reasoning. So you think that's pretty important for this community. And this makes it a powerful tool you can use to master the universe. So you can do this with it. And actually, that joke is kind of not funny because it's actually true. The United States government has been crushing our enemies with Bayes' theorem ever since World War II. It's actually been it was so fundamental to winning the war, in winning the World War II, and also winning the Cold War and fighting the Russians and so forth, that for the first half of the 20th century, almost all the important discoveries and applications regarding Bayes' theorem were classified secret and therefore kept from the public. The reason being is they didn't want our enemies to figure out that Bayes' theorem was fucking useful. Now, if you want to hear that story, there's a really good book now on the history of Bayes' theorem, starting all the way back with Thomas Bayes, back when the vampires were born. And her name's Sharon Birch McGrain, and she wrote this really good book called The Theory That Would Not Die. And this is the subtitle, it tells it all. How Bayes' rule cracked the Enigma code, hunted down Russian submarines, and emerged triumphant from 2 centuries of controversy. And so it's a really good book on the history of Bayes' theorem, and you can see how it actually has been very important. It's now foundational in the insurance industry. Pretty much anybody who seriously has actual risk, serious risk involved is going to be using Bayes' theorem because it's the best way to work with probabilities and situations like that. There we go. Now, before I get back to Bayes' theorem, I want to pause for a moment about just math in general. It's important that you learn more math, that you get more comfortable with math, even if you're scared of math. And not just so you can understand Bayes' theorem, because really the kinds of applications that you, like an average skeptic, might apply Bayes' theorem, you don't need the really fancy, hardcore technical stuff that scientists use. Their versions of Bayes' theorem. You can use really simple arithmetic. You can use Bayes' theorem in a really simple way. So you don't need really advanced math. You just need some basic mathematical principles, some general ideas of probability theory, and so on, which you can learn and are actually kind of cool. But there's another reason you need to know math and need to have a good idea of math, is the fact that everybody with a special interest or a power play against you is using it to manipulate you. Corporations, political interest groups, marketing companies, they're all using math to control you and manipulate you, and they're depending upon your math literacy in that. And there's hardly any like political policy debate, like a specific policy decision that can't be confirmed or refuted in about 10-second calculation if you just have some basic data, which you could get for 5 minutes on Google. So it's important to have a general idea of this. And if you want some ideas, like some examples, there's these 2 really good books, Innumeracy, Mathematical Illiteracy and Its Consequences. It's a short, interesting book, but more elaborate with more hardcore modern examples is Proofiness, The Dark Arts of Mathematical Deception. I recommend both of these books, and I think every responsible citizen needs to know how to use math to evaluate claims and arguments, even your own. So read these books. I also want to introduce you to this lady, this beautiful girl here. This is Danica McKellar, known by many roles as actress, goddess, mathematician. She actually has a degree in mathematics. She has a mathematical theorem named after her that she co-discovered and published in a mathematics journal. And she's also now sort of become an ambassador for mathematics to the public community. She's really been pushing, trying to get more girls in high school interested in math and not being pushed out of math and by certain social attitudes that make them feel like they have to dumb themselves down to be pretty, for example, or other different cultural differences. So she's written a series of books starting with Math Doesn't Suck, that cover grades 6 through 10, that are kind of like textbooks, basically, of teaching you the math you need to know to excel at these math things. And they're aimed at girls in a variety of ways. It's kind of feminist in a number of sort of indirect ways. But I've read these books, and they're really good, and I think they're just as good for boys, especially if you have teenage boys that are growing up. Give them this book. Not only will they learn math, because it's really good, it teaches math really well in a sort of intuitive, smart way, but it also teaches them about girls. And they'll thank you for it, trust me. And they're also not too dumb for adults. I mean, in fact, this is the first one. This is 6th grade math this book covers, Math Doesn't Suck. And it's my favorite one. I love this book, and I learned things from it. It was very, very useful. And in fact, I still reference it back when I need to do certain things. Now, she's done other books for the other grades, Kiss My Math and Hot X Algebra Exposed. But Math Doesn't Suck is the book that you most will need, because this book contains all the math that you actually are going to be using a lot in your daily life. So there's hardly anything in here that isn't useful in some application in the normal way that you might engage yourself as skeptics, but even as ordinary people. And I say that that's with regard to American public high school standards math, There's other math that you need to know as well that's not on the American standards, and therefore she didn't include it in this book. But this is a good book to start with for a lot of the really basic stuff. Now, these are some other books if you really are scared of math or want to learn more about math, but you want something that's not written for mathematicians and engineers and science students. The Mathematical Palette is specifically written for art students, and it actually teaches you a broad range of different mathematical concepts and fields. It's a really good book for that purpose. And then 101 Things Everyone Should Know About Math is written for the general public. So these are two really good books for getting you up to speed. Now, I want to stop for a moment to talk about to go back to this book here. I was once giving a tutorial on Bayes' theorem to a bunch of college professors, and there was an Ivy League professor in the group, and as I was going through, explaining some of the basic ideas of the multiplication and stuff, and he raised his hand, he said, well, how do you multiply percentages? Because like 100% times 80% is 800%, and what kind of result is that? And I stopped and I said, holy shit. Yeah, so, there it is. It's page 163, so get you up to speed on that. And in case any of you are shrinking in your seats going, oh shit, I don't know the answer to that question either, it's really simple. You just convert percentages into decimals and multiply. So 80% times 80% is 64%. 80% times 100% is still just 80%, and so on. So little things like that you can learn from her book, and that's why if you're not even that up to speed on math, you can get up to speed, and it's a good book for that kind of thing. Now, another thing I want to talk to you about is dependent probability. Dependent or conditional probabilities, there's a number of different ways you can calculate these, and oftentimes when you go to like Wikipedia, it'll be really confusing, or you won't see the practical applications of it. But there are different ways to understand dependent and conditional probabilities. This is one of them. If you were given a test or like a quiz, and you said there's someone standing behind that door, but you have to guess what sex they were. It's either a boy or a girl. You don't know. If you don't know any information about it, it's 50-50, right, roughly. The percentage is close enough to 50-50. However, but they tell you that the person's name back there is named Jane. Well, now the odds change. Now, given the fact that someone is named Jane, now if we assume that 99 out of every 100 people selected at random whose name Jane is a girl, then the probability that they're going to be a girl is now 99%, not 50%. However, 99% means that there's a 1% chance that they are a boy. So that's an important thing. Once you get information, you're talking about a probability that's dependent on another assumption being true, the probability changes. And Bayes' theorem is actually based on this principle. And it's all about ratios. The way you would figure this out is just like this. The prior probability that Jane is a girl, that someone named Jane is a girl, equals the number of Janes that are girls divided by the number of Janes that are girls plus the number of Janes that are boys. And that's how you see the math equation, really simple arithmetic down on the bottom. Now, the thing to notice here is that these are the same number. So that when you see a ratio like this, that's the same number. And it's key because the other thing that's true about this is that the bottom is the sum of all possibilities. So you have the 99 girls named Jane, and you have the one boy named Jane. That's all the Janes there are. So you put all the Janes there are on the bottom, and then you put the one on top that you're trying to calculate the ratio of. Now, the significance of this is that Bayes' theorem is just like that. Notice that these expressions, the one that I've just highlighted here, are exactly the same. So what you're looking at is a ratio. So it really works down kind of like this. The probability of a claim being true equals A divided by A plus B. And then you just have to figure out what the A's are and the A and the B are, right? And it's kind of, this is like the ultimate reduced concept of Bayes' theorem, is that the probability that a claim is true equals the number of times it's true divided by the number of times it's true plus the number of times it's false. So let's say you had a body of evidence, and you can draw a lot of conclusions from this, and you've been doing it for a while, and not every, like, you get about 9 out of 10 times you find out you get the correct conclusion from this body of evidence. The probability that your next conclusion you draw from that evidence is going to be true is 90%, because you've got your past experience, you're wrong about 1 out of every 10 times, so your next time it's probably going to be 1 out of every 10 times. Bayes' theorem is the way of using this kind of ratio concept. And again, notice, these are the same number. So from now on, I'm going to gray out that one little expression on the bottom because it's just a copy of the one on the top. And now you understand what it's doing there. We can ignore it, and you won't be distracted by it from here on out. That leaves 2 expressions to look at that you have to understand. So it's getting easier. We're getting there. So what does that mean? What does the thing up top mean? What does that complex equation mean? In the sort of basic plain English sense, or sort of pseudo-English, this is kind of bastard math-English hybrid. It's a chimera. It means this. It means that given all that we know, given all the information that you have about the world, about physics, about human nature, about history, about everything you know, and all the evidence and so on, the probability that our explanation is true, the explanation we're testing, equals how typical our explanation is. In other words, how typically is that the explanation of that kind of evidence, times how expected the evidence is if our explanation is true. So if you assume your explanation is true, how likely is the evidence we have the kind of evidence we would have? How expected is it? And then you divide that, again, you're repeating the above expression, and you add that to how atypical our explanation is. Or, in other words, how typically are other explanations true rather than ours? Times how expected the evidence is if our explanation isn't true. In other words, we assume that if some other explanation is true, not ours, then how likely is the evidence we're looking at? So you actually have to take into account alternative explanations of the evidence. You can't ignore them. So this idea of trying to start with a theory, and if it fits the evidence, then it must be true. No. You also got to look at alternate theories of the evidence and see, do they explain the evidence better? And so this is how Bayes' theorem takes that into account. To give it a sort of visual idea, and this is a very rough approximation, but this is the most intuitive way I could think of trying to make it seem. But if you have like a set of scales, and on one side you have the hypothesis you're testing, on the other side you have all other hypotheses besides yours, to explain a body of evidence, and each end of that scale has two baskets on it. And one of those baskets you fill with eggs representing how typical your explanation is. The other basket you fill with eggs representing how likely the evidence is, and then you do the same thing on the other side, and you see where the scales fall. I'm going to give you an example of this based on a UFO report story that really hit the press and national television. Made it all the way to the Larry King Show in 2008. And the original reports that came out of Stephenville that you were reading in the newspaper were really sensationalist. Like, when you're reading them, you go, this can't possibly be true. This is like unbelievable. And the story was that there were dozens in a Texas town, dozens of independent eyewitnesses, reported seeing a UFO, a large, silent object with bright lights. Oh, unfortunately, the text isn't translating. Okay, I'll just tell you what it says. And some reported seeing fighter jets chasing it, and witnesses said the object was 1 mile long and half a mile wide. So you think if these are the actual things that they were seeing, it's pretty incredible. When you started looking at like the MUFON reports and so forth, you look at the actual original reports that the press was sensationalizing, it sounded a little bit more like what's in the middle here. Now this is not a picture of what was seen in Stephenville. This is a picture of a meteorite breaking up in the atmosphere. And so you have multiple lights that are kind of flying in formation really fast, and they're spread out over a large distance, and they're changing color. And these were all things that were reported about this strange object over Texas. So the initial idea was that this really sounded like a meteor breaking up in the atmosphere. Now, if we think of it in that terms, we think of prior probability. And in past cases, let's suppose we looked at all past cases where you saw these kinds of descriptions, and then you saw where the investigation led and what it concluded. And you found that 9 out of 10 times in past cases, it turned out to be a meteor breaking up in the atmosphere. If that's the case, you have that background knowledge, you've seen it happen 9 out of 10 times before, that means the odds that this one is going to be just like that are also 9 out of 10. And so that's a 9-to-1 odds. You put 9 eggs in one basket, 1 in the other, and you get heavily weighted towards the meteor explanation. However, we have a basket still to fill. So we can't end the investigation there. We can say, well, odds are that's what it is. I don't know for sure until I do an investigation. But if I can't do an investigation, I really just have to settle on the fact 9 out of 10 odds it's a meteor. So we know meteors often look a lot like that, the way that these witnesses are describing it. Spacecraft don't tend to look like that so much, because they didn't actually describe the kinds of attributes that you would expect for a spacecraft. The kinds of weird things they were describing, the lights somewhat changing shape and color and distance and so forth, sounds a lot more like meteors. So I figure, I don't know. Maybe spaceships could look like that. Aliens are weird, right? So let's suppose alien ships, we're supposed to know somehow magically that alien ships look like that half as often as meteors do. Now we know the probability has to be much less than that, because alien ships would look much more like, we've seen tons of movies in which alien ships are well conceived by the creators of those movies. We know what people understand an alien ship would look like. They don't normally look like these kinds of things. But meteors look like them a lot. So we do that. We put the eggs in the basket. we have 6 to 3 eggs. But that's, again, it's weighting even heavier towards meteors. So now that we look at the evidence, we consider the evidence in there, it's getting even more heavily weighted towards meteor. However, if you do the mathematics, if you do that properly without using the scales and trying to make the eggs work out mathematically and so forth, if you just do the math right using the equation, you get a probability with those sort of assumptions that I put in there. You get a probability of 94.7% chance that it's meteors. Now, that means there's about a 1 in 20 chance you're wrong. Now, if you did this like every 100 claims, that means 5 of those claims are going to be false. So you're going to be wrong a lot. This is not a very high level of confidence to be in, but it's high enough to be sure that it's not going to be aliens. However, if you get more information, more evidence, you can update the equation and you actually find out that it can actually overweigh even a high prior probability towards meteors. It's 9 to 10 chance it's meteors, but with enough evidence, you can confirm it's not meteors, it's something else. Now, it turns out that the US government confirmed that at that time and location, an aerial flare drop test had occurred. And notice some of the other features of the reports where some saw fighter jets chasing them. Well, no, actually, they were flying in front of them because they were dropping them. And witnesses said the object was 1 mile long and 1/2 mile wide, which is about right for a flare drop system. This happened, the lights I have down here on the far side here, that's the Phoenix lights, which created a similar UFO scare. It looked like a chevron-shaped gigantic ship 1 mile wide floating slowly over Phoenix. It turns out these are flares just floating. They are attached to parachutes. They get dropped and they just float to illuminate the ground below so soldiers can fight in nighttime. But it's just flares, but your eye fills in. They're just these separate lights floating free, but they're flying formation and they form a shape. Your brain fills in the shape and you see an actual physical triangular object in there. So you see a spaceship, but there isn't really one there. So we've seen this kind of thing before, and it turns out the military actually confirmed that that's what had happened. So if we take this into account, we get a lot of eggs stacked in the flares basket, and we get a huge drop on that side. This is the evidence that fills all of that basket. We know that the location is an established Air Force training area. Where the people were seeing this thing happen, we knew that was an Air Force training area, so that's actually known information. The Air Force confirmed a flare drop test occurred there at that time. That's pretty good evidence as well. Flare drops look exactly like that. In fact, the flare drops fit the evidence better than any other theory, even meteors, because meteors don't typically break up in the atmosphere. You just see one streak. But they do occasionally break up in the atmosphere and look like that. But flares always look like that. And then, of course, there's no other evidence arose that supported meteors or aliens. No satellite data, no radar data, no ground invasions or anything like that. So we got a huge hit towards flares. So we started, notice all the eggs in that meteor basket there. The prior probability is really heavily weighted towards meteors, but we put all that evidence in, it changed everything, and now that's where we are. And the important thing to point out through all of this, so even though fast-moving lights reports usually meteors, the evidence outweighs that by at least 1,000 times. If you do the math, figuring out the odds that all these things in white boxes would occur for any other reason are so low that it's about 1,000 times, at least 1,000 times, probably more difference. So if you were to work this out, if we assume, for example, 9 out of 10 times it's meteors, that's that previous assumption, and 9 of the 10 times it's not meteors, it's flares, and let's be generous, the rest of the time it's alien spaceships. This is if, or it's hypothetical. And ships produce evidence like that half as often as meteors do, like that assumption we had earlier. But flares produce such evidence at least 1,000 times more often than meteors do, which we found when we looked at all the evidence afterwards. Then you get, when you do the math, you get these equations. You get a 99% chance it's flares, a 1% chance it's meteors, and a 0.006% chance it's aliens, which is about a 1 in 18,000 odds against aliens. And remember, we were being very generous. If you were to adjust these percentages toward more realistic numbers, those odds would go even further against aliens. Now, this conclusion is intuitively obvious. It's what you were already doing in your head throughout this process, and how you would have done it had I never even mentioned Bayes' theorem and just presented the evidence. It's basically the same conclusion you would have come to on your own. Bayes' theorem simply explains why that's correct, why you're thinking correctly when you do that. As long as your intuition is balancing the probabilities according to Bayes' theorem, and knows what probabilities you're supposed to be balancing, then your estimates of the odds that any given explanation is true will be correct. And it turns out this is true with any reasonable numbers at all. Like, you can put almost any numbers into the equation. As long as they're even remotely reasonable, you're going to get pretty much every time, the math is always going to work out to about 100% chance it's flares, and less than 1 in 18,000 chance it's aliens. So that's the basic idea of how Bayes' theorem works and what it's doing. So let me go back and look at this complicated equation again. What is going on here? Well, I don't expect you to think of this as written in a foreign language. These are foreign words. You don't need to know what each word and letter means right off the bat. It's just like you're trying to translate German. And so let's say this is, or Russian. It looks more like Russian, right? Let's say, or it looks like Sumerian, actually. It's ancient Sumerian. So Buffy fans, this is a spell. Okay, so what that first thing in the equation is saying, what expression there, what that means is, that's the probability that the claim H for hypothesis, that's the probability that the claim H is true given the evidence E and their background knowledge, B, everything else you know about the world. And E plus B, that's all the knowledge you have. So that's all your information is in there. Given everything you know, what is the probability that your hypothesis is true? And you calculate that by running these other numbers in here. And remember, this is the same as above, so we can ignore that and just concentrate on three numbers. The prior probability your hypothesis is true, the probability based on past cases. The likelihood of the evidence if your hypothesis is true, so remember how well the evidence fits what you expect if your hypothesis is true. And the likelihood of the evidence if some other hypothesis is true. Now you're saying, you might notice there's a fourth number there. That number is actually a derivation of the first number because, remember, if it's 9 in 10 chance it's meteors, that automatically means it's a 1 in 10 chance it's not. So if you know the one prior probability, you always know the other prior probability, which means there's really only three numbers that you need to worry about. And those are those three premises. Each one is a statement of probability. And in fact, you can take almost any argument that's been posed to you, or any argument you make to anyone else, and you can model it in Bayes' theorem. And you can actually model out, like, this is what I'm actually arguing, and this is what you're actually arguing. Which means that every argument boils down to just three numbers. And often, if you're arguing with someone, you will already agree with two of those numbers, or you won't need to disagree. Even if you do disagree, it's not necessary to disagree. Which means that boils any argument down to a dispute over just one number. You can then analyze the soundness of the case being made for that number and expose what's wrong with it, or accept the conclusion. And that's one of the most powerful uses for Bayes' theorem as a rationalist. Now I've given you that's a really short basic tutorial on what Bayes' theorem is and what the equation means. But I also want to talk to you about why you should care. What's the use of this thing? There are a lot of things, once you understand Bayes' theorem, like once you get it, you get that eureka moment and you understand it. And maybe you don't have that yet, but if you keep pursuing looking into it, you might get to that state. It took me a while to get to that state as well. But once you get there, you start to learn all kinds of new things, really clever things about how correct reasoning works that you probably didn't think of before. And that's one of the greatest uses for Bayes' theorem. And I'm going to give you a few examples. These aren't all of them. These are just some of the things you learn. One of the things you learn is that prior probability thing is always a relative probability, not an absolute probability. And this is a common mistake that people make in arguing and reasoning. I run into it all the time when I argue about the resurrection with Christian apologists, the resurrection of Jesus with Christian apologists. I'll give an example in a moment. The point here is that it doesn't matter how rare meteors are, for example. When you go back to that example, what matters is how often lights in the sky are meteors rather than aliens or something else. It's the relative probability of all the possible explanations. It's not the absolute probability that meteors occur. So, for example, if 9 out of 10 times lights in the sky are meteors, then even if the odds of seeing a meteor are 1 in a million, the prior probability that lights in the sky are meteors is still 9 in 10. The 1 in a million is irrelevant to this analysis. So this is where we get to the resurrection argument. To translate that, it doesn't matter how improbable it is that the disciples of Jesus stole his body and lied about seeing him risen in order to promote their social reforms. That seems like a wildly improbable hypothesis. Like that seems amazing. Like that probably could have only happened once in history. Once in history. Oh wait, it kind of did, but doesn't matter what the odds of that are. It could be 1 in a trillion against. Doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. What matters is how frequently religious fanatics do things like that relative to how often they actually witness corpses being reanimated. If only 1 out of 10 times bodies are actually reanimated, notice that's an extremely generous assumption. If only 1 out of every 10 times bodies are actually reanimated, and the rest of the time the claims of reanimation are bogus, then the prior probability of reanimation is simply 1 in 10. Remember that earlier trillion to 1 against, it's irrelevant. We're at 1 in 10, that's it. That's your prior probability. Remember the Jane example. It's just like that. If of any 100 people named Jane, 99 are girls and 1 is a boy, the probability that someone is a boy, given that their name is Jane, is simply 1%. It doesn't matter how improbable it is to be named Jane in the first place. As long as you know that first ratio, that 99 to 1 ratio, that's the only information you need. Now, another thing you learn is that you don't need to know the actual frequencies or probabilities of anything. For example, you already know that whatever the actual frequency is of corpses being reanimated, whether it's 0, whether it actually has a frequency, it doesn't matter. You don't need to know what it is. You know it's certainly not higher than 1 in 10. In fact, you know it's not even 1 in 10. Because that would mean 1 of every 10 missing bodies has risen from the dead. And, I'd play, like I note here, I'd play hell with Social Security, right? How would we legislate for that? You're out of luck, you died. You can even explore what that rate could possibly be. Can it be higher than 1 in 100? Can it be higher than 1 in a million, 1 in a billion? Given the evidence you know, what's the highest rate that would fit the evidence? And there is some rate above which you are confident it's not that frequent anyway, right? No matter what the actual frequency is, but you can explore where that boundary is. And that's one of the useful things you can do with Bayes' theorem. You can also run the math for all kinds of different values, just to see what it would take to convince you or what you would have to believe in order to believe any given conclusion. So it actually shows you how to make your beliefs more consistent. But ultimately you have to have good reasons for any number you settle on. And usually you can settle on just that sort of, it has to be less than 1 in 10. So anything you come out with 1 in 10, you know it's going to be less than that. So you can have those sort of uncertain probabilities, and they work just fine. So this is the thing, like whatever a Christian insists that frequency is of missing bodies being reanimated, they have to provide actual evidence that that is indeed the frequency. Because we have lots of evidence of religious fanatics lying, hallucinating, exaggerating. So we know that behavior is frequent. Do we know reanimations are? We do not. So we don't have that kind of background knowledge that establishes that frequency. Never know for sure if it's responding to me. But remember, that's just the prior probability. Even if corpse reanimation is extremely improbable, good enough evidence can overcome that. Remember the flares example. But you have to actually have that evidence. And that's the real challenging part for Christian apologists. Now, for those of you who want to hear the rest of this argument and want to see a Bayesian, the conclusive Bayesian argument against the resurrection of Jesus, which actually answers all the attempts to use Bayes' theorem to prove Jesus rose from the dead. Yes, Christians have tried that. If you want to see the ultimate argument for that, that's in my book, or in the book Christian Delusion, edited by John Loftus. I have 2 chapters in that. One of them is my definitive chapter on the resurrection, which is all in plain English, but if you look in the endnotes, it translates those things into the Bayesian terms, and so you can see how Bayes' theorem translates between ordinary reasoning, ordinary descriptions of reasoning and not. But I've also got, in this book, The End of Christianity, which is being sold today. In fact, I only get money from this book if you buy here. So buy The End of Christianity, especially if you're interested in Bayes' theorem, because I have 3 chapters in this. One is my foundational moral theory chapter, but the other 2 are Bayes' theorem, applying Bayes' theorem to things, and one of them proves that the whole religion, the whole Christian religion is false, just based on how it began. And not just the resurrection, but a lot of other facts. You'll find a lot of really interesting things in there, interesting facts, but you'll also see how Bayesian analysis can lead you to understand the sort of things you felt intuitively but couldn't articulate as an argument. Bayes' theorem makes it slam dunk, and it turns it into an argument over numbers, which you get to the point where they can't dispute those numbers anymore because you're being so generous to their side, and yet you're still getting the conclusion that you're arguing for. They can't tweak the numbers any further without looking completely ridiculous. And I also, in this book, have a chapter applying Bayes' theorem to the design argument. I apply it to evolution versus creationism. I apply it to the biogenesis argument. But I also apply it to cosmology, and I show, and it's interesting that I'm not the one who did this, but I just put it in lay terms, but I show that the fine-tuning of the physical constants, the fine-tuning argument, which many of you have probably heard many a time, actually proves that God does not exist. Now, you might think, how the hell do you do that? Well, read that chapter. And like I said, this isn't me. There were actually 2 teams of mathematicians, independently of each other, not even knowing about each other's work, came up with the same Bayesian conclusion using the same Bayesian analysis, proving this point. I cite them in the chapter, and I explain in plain English what it is that what they discovered and why they're right, and they are right. So that if you want to see, and those chapters also really explain more of Bayes' theorem. They give you examples of applications of Bayes' theorem. So if you want an early glimpse of trying to learn more about Bayes, this is the thing. I also reference more books you could read about Bayes in these chapters as well. But if you want my definitive book explaining Bayes' theorem and how to apply it, my book, Proving History, Bayes' Theorem and the Quest for the Historical Jesus, is done. It's gone through peer review. It is now slated for release in April of 2012. And I've made a really concerted effort to make this intelligible to historians and humanities majors. So it doesn't depend on you being a mathematician to understand it. And that gives you a lot of examples and also sets up the stage for arguing that Jesus didn't really exist. This book doesn't argue that specifically, but it does show that all the arguments for his existence are based on faulty logic using Bayes' theorem. Now, other things you learn, which I'm not going to go into, are the extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Bayes' theorem actually proves that this is correct. Absence of evidence sometimes is evidence of absence, and in fact, Bayes' theorem tells you when it is and when it isn't. So let's give you an example of that last one that you all just read. We'll start with this particular argument. And many of you may know this. If you don't know this, you should, because this is 300 BC. Epicurus made this argument, and it's kind of definitive. I mean, really, the argument's done. Like, walk away. Like, why they keep going, I don't know. But is God willing to stop evil but unable? Then he is not powerful. Is he able but unwilling? Then he is not good. Is he both able and willing? Then how can there be evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? Let me give you an example. I'll just take one example. American slavery. I don't have time to retell its horrors. Just suffice it to say, it's one of the most evil fucking things we ever did. Couldn't God have just given Southern whites a revelation explaining this? I mean, it's super easy to do. Just think of the hundreds of years of lives that could have been changed for the better. Just think of how Africa, what state it would be in now had it not been ravaged by slavery. I mean, it's just, it boggles the mind. The way the world would be a better place. Just a booming voice from heaven and the light, hey, the slavery thing, that's fucked up. Stop that. I don't approve it. Easy. Easy peasy. The Bible doesn't say one word against slavery. In fact, it explicitly codifies it along with the Ten Commandments as part of God's law. And it treats slavery as a moral norm throughout. Even the New Testament, even Jesus treats it as a moral norm. So this is really a slam dunk argument. I mean, this is clear cut. I mean, the odds that God would not speak out against this absolute unbelievable horror, especially to people who are devotedly, supposedly following him, or certainly want to follow him, many of them probably did. I mean, come on, it's obvious. This is a no-brainer. So, we could win the argument just on that alone, but, what about that ass load of excuses believers always wheel out at this point? And that's where, oh, by the way, also known as making shit up, but that's where we get to this question. Ad hoc reasoning, making up excuses to explain away. Because you can pick any hypothesis, and you can make it fit any body of evidence by making up any number of excuses that you need to make that happen. Now, let's suppose you make up an excuse for God, but you don't have any evidence that he has that excuse. You're just saying, well, he could have that excuse. And let's say you don't have any evidence against him having that excuse either. So it's either 50-50. You really don't know. It could go either way. Now, that means that so far as you know, it's as likely as not, a straight-up 50-50 chance. And if you do that, you diagram it, you have like this circle here, represents all the hypotheses, all the God hypotheses you can think of. Half of them, in frequency, half of them have this excuse and half don't. Which means that the probability of your hypothesis being true with that excuse equals half the prior probability of your hypothesis, full stop. So coming up with these kinds of excuses halves things, and this is how it works. If the probability that God exists, given your background knowledge, equals 0.5, Now, this is extremely generous. I'm just saying that you have no evidence against God's existence, and you have no evidence for. You just somehow, giant rubber tire machine just popped out a sentient being, and he has no prior background knowledge at all. And someone, evangelist, comes up to him talking about God, so he has no idea, no prior information. Well, it's 50-50, right? Notice I'm being extremely generous. And there's a 50-50 chance that God has the assumed excuse. So you have this sort of randomly created person, and then this evangelist comes up and he says, God. And he says, well, there's this other guy talking about slavery, and that sounds pretty fucked up, and that kind of contradicts your hypothesis. He says, oh, well, he could have this excuse, 50-50 chance. Well, that means the prior probability that your special God exists, given your background knowledge, is now 0.25, because that's half of that, because the other 0.25 is taken up by gods that don't have that excuse. So the probability that God exists becomes half as likely. You see where this is going? Now, that's for a case where it's 50-50, no evidence for or against God having that excuse. What if it's an unlikely excuse? The dog ate my homework. I couldn't have done it. I was dead at the time. Claims that are almost never true, and you actually have some evidence that they're probably not true. Let's say an example like 1 in 100 times. Let's say like the dog ate my homework. Let's say we did a research study. This would be an interesting one to do. Say you did a research study and found that 1 out of every 100 times that kids say the dog ate my homework, a dog really ate his homework. And that's being generous, 1 out of 100, I don't know. But let's say that were the case. That would mean that the prior probability that that excuse is true is 100 times less. So now you've got the probability of the hypothesis with that excuse times 1 over 100. So it's getting really, really small. It's 100 times smaller. So again, let's say the prior probability that God exists, some God exists, is 0.5. It's 50-50. And there's at best a 1% chance that God has the assumed excuse. Then the prior probability that your special God exists, given your background knowledge, is 0.005. In other words, the probability that God exists, the prior probability that God exists, becomes 100 times less likely. So the more desperate your excuse, you're actually hurting your case. You're actually making your hypothesis less probable. So put it another way, if benevolent gods exist at all, nice gods without that excuse are 100 times more likely, at least. Why? Because they're far easier to imagine and far simpler to produce. Just don't add that one extra annoying thing, and presto, better God. So, what's the probability that a benevolent God would have a valid excuse not to say one heavenly word to his devoted believers throughout the entire history of American slavery? And what evidence do you have supporting that probability? Now, when we look at it, we've looked from our background knowledge of benevolent beings, and we know a lot of them, or we've met them, they're called human beings. Of all the benevolent beings that we've seen in action and have knowledge about, who have the power to speak unharmed, so they can't be harmed for speaking their mind. Of all of those people, we put them together throughout history documenting, a valid excuse not to speak up against slavery is so rare, we never see one instance of it. Or certainly, if there is one, it's extraordinarily rare. Rare means infrequent, very infrequent, which means very improbable. So, in fact, it's got to be at least 1 in a million. Like if you have like a million benevolent human beings who could speak out against slavery without being harmed for it, how many of them do you think would have a valid excuse not to speak? Less than 1 in a million. I think all of them would have a valid reason to speak and not have a valid excuse not to. So that means that less than 1 in a million benevolent beings with the ability to speak unharmed have a valid excuse not to at best. Now that means that the prior probability that your God exists becomes 1,000,000 times less likely. So as soon as you start trying to come up with these excuses, you're actually making your hypothesis wildly improbable. And this is what Occam's razor does under Bayes' theorem. Another way to put it, again, if benevolent gods exist at all, then nice gods without that excuse are actually 1,000,000 times more likely. And why? Because we already observed that benevolent beings without that excuse are 1,000,000 times more likely. We have concrete empirical proof of that. So it's not even a conceptual idea. This is not even abstract. We have concrete empirical evidence confirming this, and they can't gainsay it. Now, if you put this into the equation, working out the equation, remember those 3 numbers I talked about? It all breaks down to 3 numbers. And in the equation that I'm talking about, this model I'm talking about, this number down here is already 100%. That God would not speak out is 100% guaranteed if there is no God. I mean, that's an easy equation to figure out, right? So they want this number to be 100% in order to compete. But doing that reduces this number by 1,000,000. So, this top equation, becomes this bottom equation. We start out with odds of God existing of less than 1.5 million, and this is a strong empirical case. I mean, when I say less than 1.5 million, I mean that's a good argument that we have the odds are less than that. So really, when people say that we don't have evidence against God's existence, that's fucking false. We have really, really, really fucking good evidence that God does not exist. So when you have this, if you started out with odds of less than 1 in 1.5 million, they put their excuse in to get that number, that 1% up. The end result is exactly the same odds. Exactly the same odds. So they got nowhere. Their excuse is useless. It doesn't change the equation at all. That means that no amount of excuses can change the fact that on present evidence, a living and benevolent God is simply improbable. And that's an example of how Bayes' theorem can be extremely useful to you in making this point, because you can get down to arguing about those three numbers, and they just can't. They can't argue about those three numbers, and because those three numbers, the equation works out, they can't say that math is wrong. You know, it's like, I deny all math and logic now. Okay, well, we know how that's going to work out for you. So you can read all about that. You can read all about that in April of the year 4029 AD. But those of you who don't want to wait around that long, my book's coming out in April of 2012. Now, I don't do the disproving God thing in there, but I do a lot of stuff that's very useful for understanding Bayes' theorem and applying it to history, which is broadly applicable, not just to religious claims in history. And if you want something now, like you're really eager to start learning more about Bayes' theorem and see how powerful it is and how useful it is and how it can be applied in your lives, skeptically, this book, The End of Christianity, which is available here today. And this is, right now, this is my primary source of income, is selling these books. So if you want to support my work, please buy, and I'll sign anything that you get. So come up to me and I'll sign it. And, or, you know, whatever else, buy any of my other books. I have many useful books. And that's it. Thank you.